All right, let's talk about plasma. You know, in blood banking, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. There are actually a bunch of different types, and honestly, knowing the difference can be, well, pretty critical. So that's what we're diving into today. Why so many kinds, and what really makes them unique. Let's get into it.
You know, this exact conversation happens in hospitals all the time. Someone asks, hey, what kind of plasma do you have available? And the response is often, wait, you're telling me there's more than one type? And yeah, that little back and forth, it perfectly nails the confusion we're here to sort out.
So, that brings us right to the main event. Why are there so many different kinds of plasma? Look, the answer isn't just about memorizing a bunch of names. If you really want to get the why, you first have to understand the how. You know, the basic rules blood banks follow to sort this stuff out in the first place.
Okay, so Section 1. What makes plasma different? Before we get into all the acronyms, FFP, PF24, we've got to go back to basics. It really all starts with how blood banks even begin to classify these incredible life-saving products.
Okay, so here's the fundamental principle. The whole point of giving a patient plasma is for its clotting factors, right? But here's the catch. Those factors are super delicate. They start to break down almost immediately. The only way to stop that is to freeze the plasma. And this is the really critical part. When you freeze it matters. A lot. The clock is literally ticking, and any delay means you're losing some of that life-saving power.
And as you can imagine, figuring out what to call each bag of plasma isn't simple. It's a whole process. Blood banks have to look at a bunch of different things, like how was it collected in the first place? What temperature was it stored at? How fast did it get into the freezer? How is it separated from the blood? And what happens to it once you eventually thaw it out? All these things play a part.
So with all those different variables, what's the big takeaway? What actually matters for the patient? Well, it really boils down to just one thing, the final level of a few really unstable components. We're talking specifically about factors V and 8 and proteins C and S. Pretty much all the differences we're going to talk about come back to these guys.
All right, now that we've got the basics down, let's jump into the main event, the main frozen types. These are the ones you're most likely going to run into in a hospital.
First up, we've got the one you've probably heard of, fresh frozen plasma, or FFP. Think of this as the gold standard, the MVP of plasma. That word fresh is super important. It means the plasma was frozen solid in under 8 hours after donation. And that speed is everything because it locks in the absolute highest levels of all those clotting factors we need. And get this, once it's frozen properly, we're talking minus 18 degrees Celsius or colder, it's good for a whole year, 12 months. That long shelf life is a game changer for blood banks, giving them the flexibility to keep it on hand for whenever it's needed. So let's put these frozen types side by side. You've got FFP at the top, frozen in under 8 hours with the highest factor levels. That's our benchmark. Then there's PF24. That stands for plasma frozen within 24 hours. Because it took longer to freeze, you see a slight dip in factors V, V8, and protein C. And then you have PF24RT24, which was kept at room temp for a bit before freezing. That one has a slightly lower level of protein S. You can totally see the pattern here, right? Time and temperature directly impact the final product. So, what's the practical difference here? Really, it's a classic trade-off between power and practicality. Freezing it faster, like with FFP, gets you the most potent product possible, with all those delicate factors perfectly preserved. Taking a bit longer, like with the PF24 types, gives the lab a lot more logistical breathing room, but you have to accept that you'll have a slight drop in some of those key factors.
Okay, so we've covered the frozen stuff, but what happens after it's thawed? That brings us to our next section, thawed, liquid, and reduced. We're talking about what happens to plasma once it's out of the freezer, or if it was never frozen at all.
This whole process is super important for not wasting a single precious drop. So picture this. A unit of FFP gets thawed for a patient, but they don't end up needing it. What happens? Well, it can sit in the fridge for the first 24 hours, but after that first day, it gets a new label, thawed plasma. And from that point, it's still good for 4 more days. So that's a 5-day lifespan in total after it's been thawed.
Next up is liquid plasma, and its main feature is, well, right there in the name. This stuff has never been frozen. It's separated from whole blood and just kept in the fridge. Now, because it was never frozen, it's naturally going to have lower levels of those unstable factors, V and 8. But, and this is a big but, it's absolutely invaluable in a massive trauma situation. When you don't have a single second to wait for something to thaw, liquid plasma is ready to go.
Okay, this next one is a little different because it's defined by what's been taken out.
There's this stuff called cryoprecipitate, which is super rich in certain clotting factors. Well, once you pull that out of the plasma, what's left over is called cryoprecipitate reduced plasma. So it's going to be low in things like fibrinogen, but it still has almost normal levels of other important factors, which makes it perfect for treating some very specific conditions.
So it turns out, not all plasma is destined for a direct transfusion. Some of it takes a completely different path and is used for other really important purposes, especially in manufacturing and safety.
And there are basically two main types here. First, you have recovered plasma. This is plasma from a regular blood donation that just happened to expire. Instead of throwing it out, it gets recovered and sent off to be used to make other things, like albumin. Then you have source plasma. This is different because it was collected specifically for manufacturing right from the get-go, usually through a process called apheresis.
And last but not least, there's a really important and growing category, pathogen-reduced plasma. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's plasma that's gone through a special treatment process to zap or remove a whole bunch of potential viruses and bacteria. It's all about adding an extra layer of safety for the person receiving it.
And that brings us right back to where we started. So, what's the right plasma for the patient? Well, it all comes down to the factors. It's that simple. Does the patient need the absolute max level of every single clotting factor? Then you're probably looking at FFP. Is it a huge emergency where every second counts? Thawed or liquid plasma is your go-to. The whole point is that each type of plasma exists for a reason, to deliver a very specific set of components for a very specific medical need. And knowing that, well, that's not just trivia, it's essential.